If there was a product on the market that killed on the order of 50,000 Americans a year and disabled hundreds of thousands more, you'd assume the government would do something about it. Well, there is such a product. It's been around for over 100 years, and the problems are getting worse, not better. All about cars, Vision Zero, and safety measures that actually work, coming up next. This is CityNerd, weekly content on cities and transportation. Viewer-suggested topics, always welcome. And I get a lot of requests to talk about safety and Vision Zero, and this one from Stencilized is a good example. Maybe you could talk about Vision Zero and which cities have actually made progress on traffic safety, because it's clearly going in the wrong direction in a lot of cities. Yeah, I'm not going to make a top 10 list out of this because even I'm not that crass. Okay, let's talk a bit about Vision Zero because I don't want to assume everyone knows what that is, even though nearly every US city of any size has a Vision Zero plan at this point. And it's easy to be cynical about these. They're often filled with the kind of squishy language and just really generic looking infographics that seem like they were designed to insult your intelligence. But Vision Zero really is more than that. The idea has its roots in Sweden in the 1990s, and the idea is kind of a paradigm shift grown. Because historically, when we analyze transportation projects, we do some level of analysis where we quantify all the benefits and the costs in terms of dollars, even death and injury. Vision Zero rejects this and says that you can't trade off human life and health against travel time benefits. It also takes a systems approach, meaning everything isn't dependent on each individual's quote unquote personal responsibility. It recognizes that people are fallible and they do stupid, careless things, but the penalty for doing something stupid shouldn't be their own or another person's injury or death. But it also does go into a lot of stuff about how multidisciplinary and complex it is and how you need to do a lot of stakeholder involvement. And I was in planning for a long time, and when you read stuff like this, what it usually means is nothing's ever going to happen. But look, some cities are making progress, internationally for sure. But even in the US, we have cities that are making progress. Ironically, or maybe not ironically, it seems like a prerequisite for eliminating pedestrian deaths is just having pound for pound the densest, most walkable city in the country. Not to jinx it, but Hoboken, New Jersey has now had 0 traffic deaths in 4 years. I kind of want to do a deeper dive on Hoboken next time I get to New York, but we can street view a lot of the things that the city has done. Daylighting corners, meaning you delineate the space within 25 or 30 feet of a crosswalk to make sure drivers and pedestrians can see each other using paint and flexible posts. Or using paint to visually tighten up the turning radii at intersections. And the city has reprogrammed its signals to include leading pedestrian intervals, which get the pedestrian out into the crosswalk and visible before it gives cars the green light, which I can't really show you in street view. You'll just have to imagine it. I don't want to discount anything the city of Hoboken has done. It's fantastic work. But let's be serious. It's a lot easier to get to 0 in Hoboken than it is in Dallas. So maybe the solution is to just add housing density to all our cities until they hit 50,000 people per square mile. So people are walking everywhere, clogging up traffic, and you actually have a constituency to support the kinds of things Hoboken is doing. But really, even what we think of as progressive cities aren't making much progress. And I sometimes wonder if just our whole mental model of what needs to be done to reduce severe and fatal collisions is misguided. It's always framed as a bunch of infrastructure changes that'll cajole drivers into slowing down and paying more attention. Here's a thing you'll almost always see in a Vision Zero effort. A map like this that comes out of the crash analysis, and it's often called something like a high injury network. Corridors where there are a disproportionate number of severe injuries and fatalities. And these maps of high injury networks are almost always basically indistinguishable from a map of a city's stroads. It's essentially a map of arterials that function more as highways than proper urban streets, with high speeds and terrible to no accommodation for anyone not driving a car. Related, you'll see different versions of this graphic everywhere. A Vision Zero approach will often recommend a maximum of 20 miles per hour in areas where there are potential conflicts between cars and people walking, which is basically, 99% of urban areas. Which goes to the heart of what I want to talk about today, which is we know reducing speeds just basically makes everything better. Reaction time, stopping distance, crash severity. But most Vision Zero plans struggle with this sort of chicken and egg situation around traffic speeds. The dominant school of thought says drivers don't really pay attention to speed limits. Rather, they respond to physical cues in the driving environment. If lanes are wide and it feels like a highway, they'll drive on it like it's a highway. So reducing speed limits without fixing the infrastructure itself is considered a waste of time. This to me is actually the same mindset as the 85th percentile speed rule, which says that you should do a speed study and then set the posted speed based on how fast the 85th percentile vehicle is going. I feel like we should be expecting better than this sort of circular logic from people who are getting paid professional level salaries, but I'm weird like that. And look, the streets where most of the carnage is happening are pretty far gone. They can be fixed and they should be, but it's expensive, so change is slow if it happens at all. Thankfully, we have a solution and we've known about it for at least 100 years. You see, in the 1920s, there were mass protests when cars started appearing on the streets and running people over. Now, this is not an official urbanist book recommendation, but I was in the middle of reading Manhattan Transfer by John Dos Passos, which honestly isn't a flex, it's just how it is. It's from 1925, and there are entire scenes in the book that take place around traffic fatalities and street safety protests. This was a time when there was still outrage and public debate over cars and how to deal with them. And I guess what we settled on as a society was just making it illegal to walk across the street until drivers gave you permission to do so. But in that short time where there was a debate, one of the solutions that was on the table was just to physically limit cars to speeds that were compatible with a busy urban environment. You'd think the idea of a speed governor or speed limiter is relatively new, like it's a twist on adaptive cruise control. But some form of speed governing technology has always been around. In fact, in 1923, speed governors ended up on the ballot in Cincinnati, Ohio, in a city referendum that asked voters to decide whether to limit cars to 20 miles per hour within city limits, which sounds like common sense, but you can imagine the opposition was well funded. And I think this is the last time we've ever seen speed governors on any ballot anywhere. Fast forward to last week. Jennifer Homendy, chair of the National Transportation Safety Board, actually talked about speed governors in her keynote address at the NACTO conference on May 15th. Nothing too crazy, but she talked about incentivizing car manufacturers to adopt speed limiting technology. And she mentioned that the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration had already begun rulemaking on speed limiters for large trucks. So there is awareness of this at the federal level, and you do see a little bit of movement at the local level too. New York City recently did a pilot project where they put active intelligent speed assistance, or ISA, in 50 fleet vehicles and monitored them. The vehicles drove over 130,000 miles, and records show they traveled, quote unquote, within speed limit parameters 99% of the time, which probably puts them in the 99th percentile of drivers from my experience. The city says the technology also accounted for a 36% reduction in hard braking events, and those are often indicators of unsafe driving. No surprise, European governments are latching onto this technology in a big way. I'm just going to recommend this David Zipper piece from Bloomberg and link it down in the description. Like all his stuff, it's really well written and well sourced with lots of very tasty hyperlinks. Okay, implementing speed governors might sound like a slam dunk, but you can imagine there's some objections, so in a minute I'm gonna do what I can to address those. But first, customary pause to suggest that you like and subscribe if you're a fan of reasonable speed limits and the people who respect them. Usual ways to connect on the apps, and direct support on Patreon is appreciated. If you want to support the controversial notion that people dying on our transportation system is bad and we should be doing things to stop it. Okay, obviously the way New York City managed speeds on its pilot project is not how we manage speeds as a society. Instead, we entrust every individual driver to make their own personal decision on how fast to drive. And I'd suggest to you that what people are thinking about when they make that decision isn't what's the safest thing for all the people around me, but what's the likelihood I'm gonna get a ticket. Being able to drive as fast as you possibly can without getting pulled over is like a national pastime. It's like a treasured freedom, and the whole idea of a speed governor just threatens to take that freedom away. I mean, don't get me wrong, I can imagine all sorts of extremely realistic scenarios where exceeding the speed limit is an absolute necessity. Like if I suddenly find myself being pursued by the cast of the Fast and the Furious franchise, or if someone in the next lane just looks at me the wrong way while I'm driving and I have to engage in a high-speed chase so I can confront them. I'm just not sure how all that's going to work with speed governors. Keep in mind though, the government does all kinds of things like this already, where they say, we're sure you all mean well, but we're gonna put in some safeguards just in case someone gets careless, which is a thing that's known to happen with humans. Like, your appliances have these Underwriters Laboratory stickers on them, meaning they meet standards that help ensure that you won't burn down your whole apartment building. Or you're not allowed to buy certain pesticides that are known to be harmful to kids or the environment. And you cannot buy lawn darts. And apparently, you can't go more than like 18 miles an hour on an e-scooter because that might be dangerous. Yeah, we do put speed governors on e-scooters because that's a safety problem. But 4,000-pound vehicles going like 60 miles an hour on city streets, that's just as God intended. So if we were losing 40 to 50,000 people a year to leaks from nuclear reactors, the government would be taking pretty swift action. If we were losing that many people to terrorist attacks, we'd probably create an entirely new government apparatus to deal with it. If we were losing that many people in plane crashes, we'd ground air traffic until we figured it out. But for whatever reason, we've decided 40 to 50,000 people dying every year is an acceptable trade-off for everyone being able to drive just as fast as they personally feel comfortable driving. Which is completely fine because everyone I've ever met is, of course, an above average driver. And that's all I've got. Thanks for joining today, and thanks as always to the patrons for helping to ensure that I can continue to make videos about whatever it is I want to make a video about every week. The direct support does mean a lot. Keep the great topic suggestions coming. I'll be back with a new episode next week, and I'll see you then.